Welcome, 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 welcome. Hi, my name is Reverend Dr. Melanie Jones Quarles. I am Assistant Professor of Ethics and Theology at Union Presbyterian Seminary, and I have the distinct honor of leading the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. This is our March Canon Conversations, engaging the theme Womanist Public Theology, and particularly exploring the fabulous new work of Dr. Teresa Smallwood, and her newest book is entitled Public Theology and Violent Rhetoric Examined in a Queer Womanist Critical Ethnography. For those of you who are just joining us for the first time, the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership recognizes the significance of centering Black women's scholarship as viable sources and resources for theological education. This series, Canon Conversations, was launched by the center to celebrate all things womanist wisdom, as well as to support and encourage new titles, writers, and womanist ideas. If you're joining us tonight, go ahead and drop your name in the chat and let us know where you are joining from. I'm excited to welcome my colleague, my friend, Dr. Teresa Smallwood, who was born and raised in Windsor, North Carolina, in a rural community with her mother, father, and extended family. She grew up in a Baptist. She grew up Baptist in a community that leaned into the idea it takes a village to raise a child. In 1978, she graduated from Birdie Senior High School and enrolled in the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She obtained her Bachelor of Arts in Speech Communications and Afro-American Studies from the University of North Carolina and went on to obtain her Juris Doctorate from North Carolina Central University School of Law in 1985. She began her legal career with Legal Services of the Southern Piedmont in Charlotte, North Carolina, where she also worked as a staff attorney for the Children's Law Center. In 1989, she served as an assistant district attorney until 1991, where she commenced her private practice that spanned more than 2 decades. Dr. Smallwood is a graduate of the Howard University School of Divinity, where she earned a Master of Divinity degree. And in 2011, she began her journey to pursue a PhD in ethics, theology, ethics, and human sciences from Chicago Theological Seminary, where she earned it in 2017. Dr. Smallwood has held numerous positions excuse me, at Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church, in Lewiston, North Carolina, at Israel Baptist Church in Washington, D.C., and at New Covenant Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Nashville, Tennessee. I am so excited because Dr. Smallwood joins us as the James Franklin Kelly and Hope Esther Kelly Associate Professor of Public Theology at United Lutheran Seminary in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. She currently serves as Dean and Vice President of Academic Affairs. Welcome, Dr. Smallwood, to tonight's conversation. It is such a joy and a pleasure to have you with us tonight. Well, we're going to jump right in just so we can learn more about your work and the exciting book that you have published. It is fresh hot off the press. It is a book that many of us will be continuing to learn from. Tell us about your journey. How did you come to write this book?
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Quarles. I am excited to be here with you, excited for our connection, because as you well know, I was in Chicago Theological Seminary along with you, and this is the product of my dissertation work. It has taken me quite a while to get it to publication, but most of the time we find out that we're doing dissertation work for our academic process, and if you want it to be something that has public consumption capacity, then you've got to do some more things. So it's taken me a while to get it here, but my journey was one of realizing that I felt God calling me some years ago after having practiced law for 20 plus years. I knew that there was something more I needed to do. And so I got on the bandwagon of becoming more educated. I thought at one point maybe this was heading me to the pastorate, but as Baptist, I didn't really see a place for myself once I got done with my MDiv. And there I was really encouraged to seek, more of an interrogative process. I guess they saw that I did have a little bit of analytical background. So when I went to Chicago Theological, I really didn't know precisely what I wanted to do, but I did want my work to reflect my life. And the journey was painful. I, grew up Baptist, and I said when I was young that I was born Baptist, I was raised Baptist. So, when I die, I'll be dead Baptist, all of that stuff. And as I experienced life through both undergrad and graduate studies, I came to realize that my experience wasn't a whole lot different from a whole lot of other people. And of course, what we had in common was sexual identity and orientation. And so as I really, really began to delve into what it meant to have a constructive theology, and more particularly as I was exposed to those women who were so forceful in establishing that the life and expectancy and experience of Black women could be informative as a methodology, I just saw this particular work and the journey that brought me there to be something worth considering.
Yeah, I remember not only you writing the work, or at least parts of it, but I remember then when you finished your PhD, it being an exceptional work and a stellar dissertation. So I know that it in book form certainly represents just the attentiveness that you've had to these questions, and also the time, energy, the work, the way that you've explored these things and continue to have insights on this topic. That brings me to the title. This is so rich. I mean, everyone's like, wow, public theology and violent rhetoric examined in a queer womanist critical ethnography. How did you get here in terms of titling this work?
I must say I went through a bevy of different titles. It was important to me that the womanism be named. It was also important that queer be named. I felt that at one point I was just doing a critical ethnography, but it turns out that what I really was doing was examining what are the speech acts that cause people harm, and how do these speech acts show up in our faith walk. And so that's how the whole idea of violent rhetoric came about. And what I examine in the work has to do with sermons, particularly, but it also has to do with the spin-offs that come from sermons, how people are influenced. What we see even in the grocery store is influenced by something, right? And what I find is that people sometimes gravitate to things that is performative. And those are the ways in which we can really do harm with our speech. So that's how I got there. Now, I really am in the tradition, you could say, of the one book that we know that talks about queer theology in the context of Black women's experience. And that one work really inspires me to sort of add to that corpus of things that really speak to both the queerness of it all and the womanism of it all.
I think that's, I want to stay right there in terms of why queer womanists. One of the first questions that one of the students asked me when we were selecting this book as the title for this month, it's like, what is queer womanism? Why do we need the connection of queer womanists? And I'm like, oh, it's a whole history. In terms of Alice Walker's definition, giving us orientation to a woman that loves other women sexually and or non-sexually, but also this tradition and challenge in womanism, especially in religious studies, of ways that folks have embraced or not embraced that's parts of Walker's definition, and the need for us to have distinct ways of identifying queer womanism. So just why queer womanists? Help us unpack that history, that narrative for folks who are just coming to this conversation.
Absolutely. Well, obviously, I was hinting towards Pamela Lightsey's work as it relates to Our Lives Matter. And Pamela Lightsey did a phenomenal job in my mind of helping to establish the acceptance of the terminology queer. When I was growing up, Dr. Quarles, my whole idea behind queer was very negative. And I've seen that term reclaimed, but it's been reclaimed in large measure by folk who are not writing in the theological vein. And for me, queer womanism has to do with the selectivity we make about how we identify ourselves. Obviously, there are volumes and volumes that have been written, articles and so forth, that help us sort of discern between the word gay or the word homosexual or the words that are used in the alphabet soup, so to speak, to delineate people in their sexual orientation. But for me, the word queer went a step further. That was to make a definitive statement that it's not so much worrying about the orientation as it is the experience people have in the orientation. And so queer womanism is different from womanism in my mind. And the difference is my own experience. And I make a difference because of the fact that the definition has been called into question given Walker's own walking back of certain aspects of that definition. This notion that in some ways, what she said years ago might not have application to people who have embraced that notion. And so there is a sort of reforming and a real understanding of what it means now to not just be womanist, but to be queer in that womanism in a way that says it is all right for you to be your authentic self, that being your authentic self as a queer person means that you can embrace still the deity of your choice, the understanding you have of your own faith journey, and that, the definitional communions by which we, exercise our faith is not limited to the things we understand in denominational life. That you can literally have a womanist experience, a theological experience, and be queer. And so for me, that was important. Those two distinctions, kind of walking hand in hand, really illuminate what we mean by intersectionality in a whole different light. Because now we have the responsibility of both understanding that people put their own qualifications on things. And in some ways, those qualifications too can be very, very disheartening. Or we can take a stand, as I have in this book, and say to people, no, you too are welcome at this table.
I think that's rich and profound for so many reasons. I think queer, especially queer, Black queer women, right, are looking for spaces and places that will receive their full identities, right? And having, even as sometimes seeing oneself as a marginalized population, even within queer communities, and then even a marginalized population among other Black women, right? There's this sense of what place will we get to claim and find space of our own? And so I love the intentionality by which you're framing and putting together these terms that follows a tradition that you've already named. In terms of the work of Pamela Lightsey, I'll also bring into conversation the work of Jennifer Leaf and others, right, who are continuing these conversations that come from folks like Renee Hill and others, right? Certainly. You also, I mean, it's not just queer womanist, but it's a queer womanist critical ethnography, which I think is totally intentional on your part, but also frames for us another kind of methodological resource that womanism can lean into and find value in through ethnography. So I just want you to talk a little bit about that in terms of your orientation to this queer womanist critical ethnography.
I really appreciate that question, because methodology was really an important piece that I had to kind of work through. And at the time that I was coming through the dissertation, I had, a womanist woman who did anthropology teach me about ethnography. But even in that, and Linda Thomas is, one of my sheroes, but even in that, there was very little to pull from that was strict anthropology. I had to go looking for someone who could talk to me about, or I could read, who would show me what it meant to move the needle. So, ethnography literally is about, telling somebody's story, true. It's about what kinds of things can we excavate from history, perhaps. And it is a tool of anthropology, but it also is a tool of performance studies and theories. And my go-to person is Dee Soyini Madison. She's a performance, really a professor emeritus now, but she was with Northwestern and did quite a bit of work through the School of Communication. So as you know, mine is really focused a bit on what does the sermonic moment do in terms of rhetorical violence. And so I'm really concerned about, first of all, the performer in the pulpit, and then the performer whose act mirrors other people's acts, and then the performance that causes people to walk away feeling as though they're not wanted by God, they're not loved by God. As a matter of fact, they are a mistake that God made. And so this idea of critical ethnography is not just to tell a story, but to tell it in such a way that we realize there's a problem with this kind of talk. This is a God talk that literally is basically disguising a hate talk. And that is not God at all. So the critical part of it is to say, if you love something, you ought to be able to critique it. And honestly, I truly, in my heart, deep down in my heart, I love the church. But there have been times in my life when the church really did not love me. And so now is my opportunity to speak through those who were courageous enough to talk to me and to utilize what their works have been, what their experiences have been, to tell a story that should move the needle. If there are people out there who are mishandling God's flock, that what they have in their hands is literally the capacity to scatter the flock or to bring them closer. And this is why it's critical.
That makes me think so much about Horace Griffin's kind of notion, their own receive them not, and brings, I think, this notion that you talk in terms of the pulpit and the rhetorical violence, right, that is often levied against LGBTQIA persons, right, from the pulpit in the sermonic moment, the performative. One of the terms that I know that you outline in the book, I think it's chapter 2 or chapter 3, is this notion of the bully pulpit. Mm-hmm. And what is this bully pulpit, and how has it been used to exercise violent rhetoric in the church and or in the public square?
Mm-hmm. This bully pulpit is the place in which we find these performances taking place. And rather than being a place where the dissemination of good news happens, oftentimes we find people receiving really bad news. This notion that I can use the pulpit to bully you into a particular way of being. So it becomes a tool of those who are in charge. It doesn't necessarily have to be the pastor. It could be other speakers. It could be other teachers, other leaders. But it's the idea that you would use that platform to violently and in a way that clearly is meant to harm, to hurt people, to make people feel uncomfortable, to call them out, if you will, to to really spill the tea that you haven't even taken a drink of. And this notion that somewhere along the line, you have the right way and they are on the wrong way. That's the piece that for me, the bullying was probably one of the greatest motivators. I recall being, a young practitioner in my own home, my hometown, and pastors would obviously, I was a speaker. I have had the speaking capacity since I was young. I mean, people would put me on their youth programs. I would go to women's days. I mean, it was a real circuit for me. And I never had any problem with speaking publicly. But I found, early on in my legal career, once I returned back home, because my mother had Alzheimer's, I was an only child, and there was a need to be back home. So once I got back and the word got out, she's a lesbian, then it became a situation where people would use the pulpit to try and take me down. Like whatever power I might have acquired in my own profession, you're nothing to God. That was something someone actually said to me. And I've begun to realize, particularly after I started doing the ethnography, that this is very commonplace. Like it's so commonplace until, people could actually tell me the day and time that they walked away from the church because of something someone said. And it could be something as simple as that line that comes about all the time: God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, or all of the pieces that you may not take notice of, but that we would be completely knowledgeable about and hurt by. Those are the things that people use to bully you. So the bully pulpit is kind of a play on words, obviously. We use that in journalistic venues to think about, how people push their message. But this, in fact, is a way to utilize that metaphorically in some ways, to simply say you need to back off of that. That's not your work. Your work is not to beat people over the head or to tantalize them or to cause them to feel as though they're nothing. It's almost like you get the sense that people are being put on the auction block again, or in those places where we know about our ancestors having been treated like they were inhuman. And in many instances, that's precisely what violent rhetoric does.
I think, as you named, countless, not only historical, but contemporary examples by which we've seen either in public space with folks with large churches and pastors or even in small spaces where it's been intimate. And this is the time to kind of utilize the pulpit to levy against, right, those that we may not understand, or simply that we just don't value within the community, right? I wonder, our program at Union Presbyterian Seminary, we offer a Master of Public Theology. And one of the questions that we often, return to is, what is public theology? And, what is the role of the public theologian in the contemporary moment? And I don't know. I think, I'm wondering if this person also is one who is a respondent to the bully pulpit in some ways, or if you have just some thoughts on this notion of public theology.
That really is intriguing for me as a question, because before I went to Vanderbilt as a postdoctoral fellow, I had not really heard the language public theology. I don't recall it ever coming up in my coursework for the PhD. But I get to Vanderbilt at a place and time when, both our mentor, Emily M. Towns, is running a program that she hires me to be the fellow for and the associate director for. And it was entitled Public Theology. And it was dealing with sort of, our own experience with the need for just fairness in government, fairness in everything. But through the PTRJC, as we call it, public theology, became for me a kind of call language. It was not that, I felt like I didn't still need to do evangelism, which is what I think one of my gifts might be. But it also called me into another sort of dimension of my ministry. And as I began to really think about what it meant and really identify what it meant through the collaborative, through our work, and in that program, I began to do a little research and came to understand that, public theology as a kind of sub-discipline, you might say, really has only about a 50-year life in the sort of North American context. And we just lost really what I would call the father of public theology, Martin E. Marty, who was a University of Chicago professor. Died, I think, this past week. But Marty's work really focused a lot on the public church. And then from him came various and sundry folks. I could go down the list, but I do it a little bit in the introduction in the book. The bottom line is, for me, when I think about St. Anselm's declaration in the 11th century, that theology is faith-seeking understanding, and I add the term public to that, I'm simply saying that we live our faith out loud, and we live it in a way that does not create a proselytizing kind of experience, but in faith, we want to always understand or seek to understand the other, whomever they may be. And so for me, public theology is the vehicle by which we both examine and critique, by which we also illuminate and give people opportunity to change. Now, in this context, public theology then means the ability for you to examine what you're doing and make some serious changes if you, in fact, are using this kind of violent rhetoric to harm others.
What was your most significant discovery when writing this book? What did you find shocking or surprising in the process that you learned, either about yourself or about the folks the voices that you were in conversation with? What surprised you?
Well, that question leads me to your own book, Melanie, Up Against the Crooked Gospel. I honestly think our books talk to each other, because what I found most significantly is that I had to expand my view of what certain things mean, because as I grew up, they meant something totally different. For instance, that terminology about what God created. The work took me deep into some language pieces, some understandings of semiosis, some, pierce understandings around signs and symbols. It took me to, a historical perspective on religions to really get a sense of how I, as a professed Christian, could say to folks, listen, there's no reason why you can't um, understand what conjure is about. There's no reason why you can't, you know, put your oil on or uh, move yourself through a process with smokes. I mean, there are things that we have literally cartoned off from ourselves that need not be, because if we dig deep, we will find that no, God didn't make Adam, God made Adama, a human being, right? And that human being uh, was then changed or transformed, or in the argument I make, transitioned. And so, in that, then through language, we can really open ourselves up from the cages we placed ourselves in, the shackles we have been wearing, to become people who are much more imaginative and capable of understanding the imagination and the creativity of a God of abundance.
I think that's so rich. I find on these conversations that like you, and I'm thinking about Dr. Lakeisha Lockhart and just others who we're all kind of writing at the same time. And there's different pathways that we take, but there are so many connections and ways that these intersect, which speak to, I think, the womanist theological tradition and how it has formed all of us. And we have some particular critical ways of looking at ways we might interpret what's happening now, but also giving some values for the future. Who do you think is your intended audience for the book? I know seminarians and institutions can utilize it, but who are you thinking about as you were writing, and who do you intend for the work to support?
Thank you for that. I tell a story about a young woman in my hometown who was barely understood and who ended up taking her own life. And so I think that ultimately my audience, my hopeful audience, would be preachers who engage this behavior, whom I want to see change. But obviously, I also know that the folk who participated by giving me their stories, the people who I come in contact with everywhere I go, who say, thank you for being you, or who say, you're not afraid to be your authentic self, are you? That kind of stuff. I expect that this book will be uplifting in some ways to those folks. But primarily, though, I'm hopeful that people who really want to give a completely holistic view of womanism might also include this kind of work in their introductory courses, that we will engage seminarians in conversation that opens the door for more and more and more kinds of theoretical and scholarly contributions that make people know there's no mistake here. God made us and God loves us.
How do you think this book contributes to the womanist theological tradition? I named that, but I want you to just talk about where you see the placement of this book. Obviously, as a book that adds to the categories of queer womanist perspectives, but there may be some other ways in which you think the book gives insight or value to.
I cannot not get away from our mutual ancestor. I think a lot about Dr. Cannon. I think a lot about what she was opening the door for, both from the perspective of biblical interpretation You can't just take things, as they are. Got to be interrogating the stuff you hear. You got to have a critical eye. And, the struggle of Black women is all inclusive. It's not just about Black women who, were domestics, or Black women who have been, in politics. So we all have a commonality of experience that should bring us together, right? And so for me, in some of what I've seen in the womanist theological tradition, this book helps to contribute to what I think Kelly Brown Douglas has done with the Black Christ. What I could name a few others, but I'm not sure where I sit in that. So I'm not trying to put myself way up there. But I am suggesting that when we open the door and the dialogue for more and more voices to identify and define, because I don't think the definition is finished, being tweaked. Just be honest, right? To be honest, I think the definition was a start. And honestly, as the more I read Katie Cannon, the more I believe she believed that too. And the reason I say it is because when you talk about consciousness, there's not a real container for consciousness. And let's face it, I think that was the first article when she talked about that consciousness piece. It let me know that she saw this thing blossoming and flourishing in ways perhaps that she didn't even have maybe the words or even the imagination at that moment to think about. But I always am, I return to the fact that she was a doodler, that she was into her art form. And the art form informed her work. And what I know about doodling, I'm starting to do it a little bit myself. I bought myself a bunch of coloring books, and and I'm really trying to explore my creative side more and more. But I find that something might start out small and it becomes way bigger than you ever anticipated because you let yourself be open. And I think that's the work of the Spirit. The Spirit wants to move us out and into, the places where God is that we have assumed God is not, and give us the experiences that would make life even richer.
Absolutely. There, if folks can see on my right here on the side of my screen, that is a kind of a piece of one of Dr. Cannon's doodles. And she absolutely had this kind of creative imagination. One of the things and one of the stories that she tells is that it was actually inspired by going to her therapist, who said, you got to get some way to work all those ideas out, and kind of encouraged her to start doodling. And she started with some small, as she names, and the lines and the folds and the weaving, and something else comes from it that you don't expect when you sit down to doodle. But something really emerges from that. And I love that notion, back to her early work, Emergence of a Black Feminist Consciousness, and where she unpacks or begins to understand what this womanist consciousness. I love this notion of a stream that you're pointing to, that these views are expansive and are able to, continue to be explored. One of the things I think Monica Coleman talked about in Ain't I a Womanist Too, similar to you in terms of perhaps Alice Walker's definition, which there's a question of whether it's a poem of sorts, right? Is it really a definition, but that it is malleable. It's a possibility for us to think of it as something that we could continue to form and to define for ourselves, and take it out of the limits of strict definition that this equals this. But rather Walker, or those who continue to adapt Walker, are giving us some window into what womanism could be and what womanism could start as, and could develop and grow even beyond that. So I love that. I also like this notion of this critical lens that womanism provides, all back to Cannon. Her notion of debunk, unmask, disentangle, remind me of that as the work, right, of the womanist scholar to continue to do that deep critical work. And so I see your work as following that tradition as well. You already talked about, who the book is intended for. Who are your writing muses? Like, who are the voices that you go to when you're writing that inform your work, or that that give you insight and perspective?
Well, you're still creating. But honestly, Melanie, from the time we were in our PhD programs, you've been a muse. I love how you preach. I love what you say in this book, Up Against the Crooked Gospel. And I'm looking so forward to everything you produce. I've loved that from the beginning when we first met. But I also have folk like, obviously, Dr. Cannon, Dr. Towns. One of my strong muses, of course, is Audre Lorde. This is the woman who, and it wasn't really Lorde's prose so much as her poetry, and not even her poetry so much as her, I want to say her fictional, what she calls her biomythography. Zami was the book for me. It just, it planted something in me that let me know there is a creative side to me. And I can use that creative side in service to my scholarly side. So the Lord would be the person I stop on. As a writer, as a prose writer, as a poet. Now, there are aspects of her life that, I could probably take some issue with, the same way we take issue with Alice Walker. But the reality is still she has a large enough corpus that I can get lost in it and then find my way at the same time.
Yeah. I'm thinking, speaking of PhD and going back to our journey, one of our first classes in our PhD program, and it must have been like 2012, fall 2012, was Ruther Daley Lorde. And Dr. Laurel Schneider taught that course. And it was just us as well, it was MDiv students, but I remember me and you being conversation partners the whole semester about Rosemary Radford Ruther, Mary Daly, and Audre Lorde. And so much, I think, of my formation in terms of theology has been shaped by those three voices because of that course. So much in terms of Lorde, even Daly, as much as I want to tell Daly something, then I'm like, she got something right here. And similarly to Ruther, but putting those figures in conversation was certainly a kind of the beginning of a wonderful path, an intellectual path, because back then, and perhaps still now, the voices that we have in terms of figure studies, a Karl Barth or Paul Tillich, that does not prioritize women's voices, quite frankly, that have a large corpus, right, and have the work for us to really work through. And to have those three figures has been transformative. And I find, much like you, how all three of those voices, I continue to return back to them in so many ways. One of the things that I, want to we talked about the challenges of rhetorical violence. And this is my prompt to tell folks, get the book. It is a book that you need to read. Absolutely. Bloomsbury published it, and we're going to drop it in the chat so that you can have access to it. So if you have not gotten the book, get the book. But my kind of burning question is, how do we survive rhetorical violence? because the bully pulpit may not stop, and especially in the kind of climate, social and political climate that we find ourselves in. I'm wondering, I have questions about resistance, but certainly how do we at least survive the violence that we hear and that is spewed against?
Mm-hmm. This is good. One of the things another thing that I learned, I should say, and I take this with me everywhere I go now, is that we need to understand and be in touch with our own belief system. I mean, you could survey an entire congregation and come out with more than one Christianity. You could survey the folks on the bus and realize that they all have a lot of things in common. And I've come to understand something about rhetorical violence. Large part of it is fear. A large part of it is just being bullyish. But what I do know is I survived it because of what was already in me. So I talk a little bit about, that passage of scripture that talks about, Jesus being formed in you, Christ being formed in you. And that word formed that I talk about in terms of its, its etymology is really equating the same thing that happens in a woman's body when a baby is formed. This notion that it grows and is nourished in one capacity and then it reveals itself in another. I believe totally that folks overcome rhetorical violence when they build up enough of their own self-worth, their own self-esteem, to look beyond the words that are being spoken to the meaning that God has for them in their hearts. Now, how do you get to that? Because a lot of people are, really the bullying is also at home. You must go to church. You must do this. You must do that. Find outlets. Sure, if you feel like you're compelled to go into a place that is harmful to you, I can pray for you. But I have come to the conclusion in my life that I'm not going to stay anywhere. And one of the women that I interviewed in this work came to the same conclusion. Essentially, I'm not going somewhere and subject myself to that which can harm me, or it has harmed me. The other piece that I recommend is that once you have gotten in touch with your own belief system and you know what you believe, feed it. There are online services. The Gathering is one I would recommend. There is the Pink, what is it called? Pink Robe Chronicles. There are unlimited sources for you to at least just gain that place of self-esteem and the strength that it takes. And before you know it, you will find yourself capable of withstanding much. While I don't recommend staying in a place that is harmful, I do also know there are those of us who have been sent to be frontline warriors. But the only way you can fight this kind of fight is to be reinforced and reassured on the inside. And that comes from some serious spiritual disciplines. For me, it's meditation, it's fasting, but not for fasting's sake, but fasting because you've been prompted by the Spirit. For me, it is burning my sage, lighting my candles, taking a spiritual bath, and by that I mean using my oils, sitting in warm water. My grandmother said, there is nothing going wrong in the world that you can't heal with a bath of hot water. What she was really saying is if you give yourself a space to meditate and pray, you will find that the effectual, fervent prayers of the righteous will avail much.
I think that's rich. This call in the Lenten season, right, to return back to these spiritual practices, spiritual disciplines, is just a reminder of that these are the sources and resources that will allow us to sustain these difficult, these desperate times. And that's something that I think our ancestors, our foremothers, understood a lot better than we do now. So taking hold to those spiritual disciplines is what will keep us, for sure. I can talk to you all day because we're colleagues, we're friends, we're sisters on this journey. But you know, what is your enduring takeaway or hope that you have for all of the folks who are watching us, who will come back and watch the playback? What do you hope for this book?
Well, I really truly hope that intrigue will lead them to the book, that information will keep them reading the book, and that transformation will help them recommend the book to someone else.
What a hope. What a work. And let me tell y'all again, you need to get a copy of Public Theology and Violent Rhetoric, examined in a Queer Womanist Critical Ethnography, authored by Dr. Teresa Smallwood. It is there on Bloomsbury. There are a few ways you can get it, but it is a resource that will certainly resource you in your work, in your life, and in your witness. So make your way to get a copy of this fabulous work. Thank you, Dean Smallwood, for joining us, for taking time out of your schedule to have this conversation. I think this is certainly the first of many, because this is a book that I certainly will recommend, and I hope that folks will continue to share. For others of you who've joined us tonight, or those who will come back and watch, just to let you know that we will continue these canon conversations. We are continuing to get positive feedback about these works, and we invite you to complete our survey. There's a survey being dropped in the chat now to tell us what worked for you, what you enjoyed about tonight's conversation, and what ways we can continue to bring these conversations to you to make it better. There are some folks who are dropping notes in the chat to let you know. Dr. Smallwood, congratulations on your work, Robin Join says. And there's just some celebrations there to tell you this is good work. This is fertile ground. Andre Price is dropping a note saying this is fertile ground. This is great work. So we want to encourage you to say, keep on writing for us so we can have some more works to add to our library. Last, we will be returning back on this platform for the next Canon Conversation, April 1st. It's not April Fool's. It's a real thing. We're returning, and we will be talking with Dr. Lakeisha Lockhart on her work doing theological double Dutch, as she offers us a vision for womanist pedagogy. And also, for those of you who have been following the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership, we are headed to Charleston, South Carolina, this May 1st through the 3rd. I'm telling you, it's an exciting time. We'll be starting at the International African American Museum. We'll be having some workshops and plenaries on that Friday at the North Charleston Marriott Hotel. And we'll also be having worship at Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. We all know that that is where the Emanuel 9 massacre happened 10 years ago. And so we are recognizing that, but also celebrating the fact that the International African American Museum is present now in Charleston. So there's information in the chat as well about joining us. and planning to purchase your registration and to make your way. You can come by plane, by train, by car, automobile, whatever it is, make your way to join us. Again, thank you, Dr. Smallwood, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We're going to close with a short video to invite you to our conference this May 1st through 3rd.
Calling all womanist scholars, artists, activists, and allies to the floor. I'm Dr. Melanie Jones Quarles, the director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Let me tell you, our world is in a mess, and this is no time for retreat. It's time for resistance. In commemoration of the 10th anniversary of the Charleston 9 massacre and in celebration of the International African American Museum, we invite you to Charleston, South Carolina, May 1st through May 3rd, 2025. Our theme this year, this joy that we have, acts of resistance in the face of manifold evil. Trust me, you want to be there.